Yes, colleagues, we can start.
Okay, perfect. Well, good morning, everyone from here, and good afternoon in other places. I'm very happy to be here today. My name is Diana Ayala. I am part of the GCE Youth Group, which is the YAG, and I'm very happy to be today here and hear from all experts today, and also, have questions and a debate about everything that will be happening today. So before we start, I would like to just review some housekeeping rules so we can have this conversation flowing very smoothly. Before that, I would like to say that we have the interpretation available for Arabic, Spanish, and French. So if you want the interpretation, the only thing you have to do is select your preferred language on the interpretation globe that you will see below your screen and choose your preferred language between English, Arabic, or Spanish, and the interpretation will be only available for the first hour. I will also like to ask everyone to remain on mute if you're not speaking and switch off your video. So if you're not speaking, please switch off your videos and be muted on the presentation. And when do you want to speak, please unmute yourself and switch on your video. Also, please be patient for any delay that we may have or any technical glitches. You know that with virtuality, some things might happen, technical issues might happen, but please be patient. And if you have any questions you want to make to any of the panelists today, please raise your hand on any question, or you can write in the chat if you have any questions so we can read at the end. So for starting this event, as the youth and student of GCE in celebrating this Gawa today, we have the aim to hold a discussion around decolonizing education and education financing, how youth and students organization can play a good role in ensuring that education from primary to tertiary level is well financed and decolonized. The discussion will also revolve around discussing what lobbying of decolonizing education looks like. Additionally, it will be a discussion on the expectations of the youth, what support from GCE will the youth and students organizations want also, and from governments, what support looks like. It will be based around the commitment and future plans organization within the YAG, plan to commit to ensure that they play a role in decolonizing education, and also defining what this commitment will look like and how is it to be achieved. Now we're going to start this session with the first panelist, and I'm very happy to be introducing Dr. Maria Ron-Balsera. Dr. Maria has worked for the last 15 years on the right to education privatization and tax justice. She's currently part of the Tax and Education Alliance coordinator and policy advisor on fiscal justice at ActionAid. And she manages a transnational partnership that brings together ActionAid, Education International, and Global Campaign for Education, Tax Justice Network, and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and focuses on Ghana, Nepal, Senegal, Uganda, and Zambia. She has led research on tax and education in various countries for the project and on education financing and privatization for the multi-country projects in ActionAid. Ms. Ron-Balsera is also an associate lecturer at the University of London. She has previously worked for the Right to Education Project, Human Rights Watch, and the Universities of Roehampton and Bielefeld. She has worked as a consultant for the GLADE, which is the Latin American Campaign for Education, and the Global Campaign for Education. She finished her PhD in education from Bielefeld University in 2014 in a Marie Curie Fellowship, and she also holds a master's in human rights from the London School of Economics. So now we will pass it on to Dr. Ron-Balsera. She will be talking about financing education. Is it possible?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great that we are having this global, the GAWE this year on education financing, on decolonizing education financing. So we are going to be talking about whether education financing is possible and how we can really improve it. We know it is possible, but all around the world we see that it's not adequately funded. We see that there is a chronic underfunding, And we really need to increase not only the share of the national budget that is going to education, that as we know should be between 15 and 20% as a minimum of the national budget, or 4 to 6% of the national budget. We know that it's really 20% of the national budget and 6% of the GDP that should be going to education in low and middle income countries. But for far too long, we have been focusing on the share of the budget, and we have been competing with other public services such as health or water and sanitation. So it is time to be looking at the 4 S's of the budget. So the share, but also the size. We need to increase the whole of the national budget. And the best way to do that is by increasing the revenue through progressive tax reform. I will be talking about that in just a minute. We also need to increase the sensitivity of the allocation. And this needs to be done with an equity criteria, ensuring that those disadvantaged groups, that it is just transformative, has a gender lens, right? And we also need to improve the scrutiny of the budget to make sure that it is that the allocation actually go where it should go, that it is participatory. The whole budget process should be transparent, that it should be accountable. So where are we in terms of the share of the budget? As I said before, the recommended is like 6% of the GDP and 20% of the national budget. We see that very, very few countries are there. We can see Sierra Leone, we can see the Solomon Islands, we can see Namibia, but even those countries really struggle as well because the total size of the national budget isn't big enough. We still have a long way to go, and you can see that many countries actually allocate less than 4% of the GDP and less than the 15% of the national budget. And this is actually going worse because we know that we are living a debt crisis. Many countries are actually going on debt default, and debt repayment services are really eating away the national budget. Now, the actual recommendation from the International Monetary Fund or from the World Bank is to concentrate on that, to pay debt, to lower inflation. And this is really bad because they are also advocating for privatization. And this is really the wrong way to go because we see that they cannot employ the teachers that they need. They are really like freezing all the public services workers bill. And this is so bad for economic and social development. And we are all suffering this. So how can we do it? Well, the best way to actually raise enough funding for education finances is through taxes. Why taxes? Because this is the most reliable source of income. I would like to remind you that 97% of the education financing comes from domestic sources. Only 3% comes from ODA and other sources. However, this 3% is really shaping education policy. So it is time to regain that control, and this is part of the decolonizing education financing. But so how do we raise these funds? Through taxes. We have regressive taxation, which is normally indirect taxation. So when we are buying a bottle of water, you are paying VAT or sales taxes, and this is a flat rate. It doesn't matter whether you are rich or you are poor, you are paying the same. And then we have progressive taxation, where those with more income or wealth pay more as a proportion. And this is what we are advocating for. We also know that multinational companies are really not paying not nearly enough their fair share. And this is where we really need to tackle it, because so many funds, this global tax abuse is costing $483 billion per year, which is more than enough to fund education. It's actually more than enough to fund the whole SDG program. So this is really time to tackle this global tax abuse. And another thing that we can do easily is to stop giving away tax incentives, these harmful tax incentives that try to attract foreign direct investment. It's not really working, and we are just giving away, the average is around like 5% of the GDP, which is, as you will remember, like the minimum that we should be allocating to education. So, well, as I was saying before, when countries cannot raise enough funding, they really rely on loans and debt. And this is really bringing down the economy, and it's really bringing down the social development of all these countries. Because as we see, it's not only, as we saw before in the cartoon, like the Ministry of Education is asking for more money for the Ministry of Finance. I said, well, we don't have enough money. We are cash strapped, but we are actually giving away all this money in tax holidays, in tax incentives. This cartoon shows that the Ministry of Finance is also handcuffed by the debt, right? It's really struggling to raise enough funding for education, for health, for other public services, and it has to sign to get more loans. And these loans—
Sorry, Dr. Maria, sorry to interrupt you. The interpretation is asking if we can just slow down a little so they can interpret very well. Thank you very much.
Okay. I get very excited about this topic.
It's
the more
okay,
excited I get, the faster I speak. Of course. So yes, when countries cannot raise enough funding, they have to raise money by acquiring more debts, right? More loans, because we see that less and less ODA is being given as grants, and there are more loans. And then you have private and public debt as well. And now we also have the World Bank and the IMF rescuing some countries, but this rescuing comes with a lot of conditions, and these conditions have to do with austerity. This means cutting public spending. And who are the people who are really what's the public spending? The majority of this money goes into teacher salaries, nurses' salaries, doctor salaries. So when you have to reduce the public spending, you are reducing education financing, right? And then of course, you have problems in terms of quality, you have overcrowded classes. Then another thing that they are recommending is to increase VAT. This is the regressive taxes that we were talking about. This is when the poor and women pay more as a proportion of their income and wealth, right? And then, as I said before, they are recommending public service salary freezes. And at the same time, we can see in the background that the money is actually being, it's being taken away, it's flying to tax havens, to really low taxes jurisdictions, right? And this is through avoidance and evasion, so illegal and legal. So this is all the global tax abuse that we said that in global terms is $483 billion per year. So this is just to show that austerity is really taking over the world, and we are all suffering, and education financing in particular is really suffering, because between 85% and 95% of the education financing goes into recurring costs, which is paying salaries, paying teacher salaries. And this is why it's really being pushed down with austerity, and it's actually increasing privatization that we know that really increases social inequalities, segregation. So what can we do then? So we really need to be fighting for tax justice. Why tax justice? Because it increases the 4 R's. It increases revenue in a sustainable way. It increases redistribution to curbing vertical and horizontal inequalities. So sharing, right, the wealth of the country in a more equal way. It also can be used for repricing. So taxing more things that are for instance, polluting energies, or things that are bad for health or for the environment, such as tobacco or alcohol, etc. And perhaps the most important thing is that it increases representation. It strengthens the social contract, that when the citizens pay taxes, they hold the government to account to give them good quality public services in exchange. And this is what we need to do, because when we rely on donors, then education becomes a charity, not a right. When we rely on debt, when we rely on private services, then education is a commodity, something that you buy and sell in the market, right? It becomes a privilege, and education is a right. And for that, you need proper democratic system. And this is how tax justice can really increase this representation. We were talking about the 4 S's, so we have already discussed the share of the budget and the size of the budget, like increasing it through tax justice. We also need to talk about the sensitivity of the budget. because it has to have an equity criteria. If we spend the same on every child, then we will be reproducing the current status. We need to make sure that we are really tackling inequalities, smoothing them, and it has a gender transformative element as well as inclusive budget. And we also need to increase the scrutiny of the budget. And for that, we need to make sure that the budgets are more budget cycle is more transparent, is more participatory, and that is more accountable. And for that, we also need to be more aware and more educated and be part of it and participate. And for that, we will be launching on Friday the Transforming Education Financing Toolkit for activists in order to learn what we really need to know about. It's actually based on these 4 S's. So to understand the budget, to understand where the money should be coming from, how it should be allocated. So I will invite you all to come and participate in this launch as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maria. We're definitely listening to this. It was very interesting to hear these 4 S's, which is, let me see if I have it correct: share, sensitivity, size. In the last one, I missed it. Can I have the 4th one so I can write it down here?
Scrutiny.
Scrutiny, perfect. Thank you, David, so much. That's amazing. Actually, thank you very much for that. I know that there will be questions from the panelists. Thank you so much. It's very interesting. Yesterday, we were having with Glade also a webinar about financing, and we were hearing about how we need to increase the 6% of the GDP and how we need a 20% at least from the total budget. And we were seeing how difficult it's for the Latin American region, which is a region of a lot of inequalities. So now that we are hearing Dr. Maria, we're just confirming that that's what we need, and that's just like the list. It's not like we need just 6% and that's it, but that's the list, and it's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Now we will move on, and after our second panelist, which are very related because Dr. Maria and David are actually from ActionAid. David is the head of programs and influencing with ActionAid's Global Secretariat. He's leading work on system change for climate justice, economic justice, public services, and women's rights. He was the stakeholder covenant for the Transforming Education Summit, Action Track on Financing in September 2022. David qualified as a trained teacher in research adult learning programs inspired by Paulo Freire across the Latin American region, developing the Reflect approach in the 90s. He is a co-founder of the Global Campaign for Education and chair of the Right to Education Initiative. From 2018 to 2020, he served as chair of the Strategy and Impact Committee of the Global Partnership for Education. So now we will have David also talking about some important topics about financing and decolonizing the financing of education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana. And so delighted to be with you all today. I'm going to talk about the crucial need for action in 10 areas. And try to do that in just over 10 minutes. So the first area is action to transform education, because the status quo is simply not enough. Education systems around the world are underfunded, under-resourced, have suffered from 40 years, I think, of neoliberal economic thinking that have squeezed budgets. We need to transform. And last year in September at the UN General Assembly, the highest level education meeting ever took place. It was the Transforming Education Summit at the UN with heads of state. It is the first time ever the heads of state have all been invited to join a summit specifically and exclusively on education. And the agenda that came out of that in terms of the financing is genuinely a transformative agenda. So we need to build on the commitments and the areas of action that were laid out, particularly in the call to action on financing, the call for transformative action on financing. And I will say a little bit about some of the areas of action that were flagged in that summit. So the second key point is action on domestic financing. Now, Maria mentioned already 97% of the financing for education around the world comes from domestic sources. Only 3% comes from aid and loans. All the bilateral aid, all of the multilateral aid, all of the loans that are provided by different multilateral and regional development banks adds up to just 3% of the financing. So we want to change the financing of education. We want to transform it. We need to be looking at the 97% and what can we do to unblock the domestic financing of education and increase that. Unfortunately, over the last 30, 40 years, about 90% at the time of the international community have been spent talking about the 3%. What can we do to just to increase a little bit of an aid pot here or there? That doesn't transform the system. If we're serious, we need to talk about domestic and action on domestic budgets. But that action requires the international community to also unblock things in the global financial system that are undermining domestic financing of education. Third area of action is on shares, the budget shares for education. Now, this was also flagged by Maria. 15 to 20% of national budgets should be going to education. In lower income countries, at least 20%, possibly more. The Transforming Education Summit in September, for the first time ever, said, well, look, if we're telling national governments to be spending 15 to 20% of their budgets on education, this should also hold true for aid. At the moment, only about 5% of aid goes to goes to education worldwide. That should be ratcheted up. So we do need more aid. It needs to be better quality aid, but aid will only ever be a small part of the solution. And likewise, only looking at budget shares will only be a small part of the solution, because even if you've got a 20% share of a national budget, it's a small amount if the overall size of the budget is small. So the Transforming Education Summit called for action on the next key area, which is action on tax, the fourth action on tax. Now here it points to two things. One is domestic tax revenues need to rise. You look at low-income countries, the average tax to GDP ratio is about 16%. In middle-income countries, it's 30%. High-income countries, about 40% tax to GDP ratio. The richest countries, or the countries which have got perhaps the best public services, Scandinavian countries, about 45% tax to GDP ratio. If you're at that 16%, as low-income countries are, it's very difficult to have the revenue necessary to finance a quality public services as a whole, and education in particular. So there needs to be bold action taken. One very compelling piece of research by the International Monetary Fund, I don't usually agree with them, but on this, they looked about the financing of Sustainable Development Goals and said most countries could expand their tax to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points in the next 5 years. If countries did that, you could double the spending on education and double the spending on health. So if we're talking about transforming the financing of education, it's not just a little bit more here and there. We need to be doubling the spending on education, but we can't just do that for education. We also need to be expanding spending also on health and on other public services. So action on domestic tax revenues is absolutely fundamental to that transformative change. But we also need to unblock things in the international community, because global tax rules have for the last 60 years been set by the Club of Rich Nations, the OECD, and they have created a system which allows a huge flow of illicit financial resources out of most countries and allow those resources to accumulate in tax havens where they lie idle. If we want to change the global tax rules, then it's not going to be the OECD who do that. And one of the most exciting developments of recent times is that the ministers of finance across Africa got together last year and said, we want to shift global tax policy making from the OECD to the United Nations. They took that to a vote at the UN General Assembly in November last year and won. So in future, tax rules will be set in a more democratic, representative and inclusive way. And that's part of the change that we need to see. So if we're talking about action on tax, we need both national action and international action to create fairer rules. The fifth area of action, which is absolutely fundamental, flagged in the Transforming Education Summit call to action, is action on debt. There's a huge number of countries that are now in debt crisis, at moderate or high risk of debt crisis, and those countries invariably are spending more on servicing their debts than they are spending on education. Yet the international community is doing almost nothing to actually address that debt crisis and the scale of the debt crisis. Not only is it undermining spending on education, also undermining spending on health and accelerating the climate crisis, as the latest research shows. Countries in debt end up having to invest in extractive economies in order to earn dollars to pay back their debt. The debt crisis is acute, it's severe, and we need action on that debt crisis globally to cancel unjust debts and to radically renegotiate other debts. And any country which is spending more on servicing its debts than it is in paying for education should be at the front of the queue for debt renegotiation processes. The sixth area of action is action on austerity. We are still living in a world, and as I say, the last 40 years, the IMF have really been the champion of creating a sort of cult of austerity, where worldwide the focus is almost always on cutting public spending, holding down public budgets in order to achieve macroeconomic stability and supposedly to achieve growth. Almost all of the research, independent research, shows that austerity policies have not worked. They've actually undermined growth. They've actually undermined many of the things that they claim to have contributed to. And austerity is the biggest threat to financing for education, because education is, if it's 20% of the national budget is going on education, and then you're told to squeeze the budget, education budgets suffer. The seventh critical area is action on wage bills. And this is because public sector wage bills, setting limits to public sector wage bills, is the centerpiece of most austerity policies pursued by the IMF and often internalized by ministries of finance around the world. And if you put a limit on the overall public sector wage bill, and teachers are the largest single group on that wage bill, health workers are the second largest group, you cannot achieve a holding down, a freezing or a cut to your public sector wage bill without cutting the spending on teachers. And even if you've got desperate shortages of teachers, you can't employ more teachers. And even if teachers are chronically underpaid, you can't pay teachers more. So the IMF recommendations to ministries of finance, and the ministries of finance who accept those recommendations and that advice around the public sector wage bill, are actively damaging progress on education and need to be challenged. And we need to see a reversal of that. One of the key things we tried to do at the Transforming Education Summit was bring the IMF to the table, because the IMF have never been at a high-level meeting on education in the last 40 years. We had invited the managing director of the IMF, and she was going to face a challenge at that summit, and she backed out and ran away 2 days before the meeting and refused to turn up, even though she was in New York. We are keeping the pressure on the IMF, and we are trying to make sure that in future, the global education community recognizes that the IMF are the ones who are shaping the financing that is available for education, and we're not going to make a breakthrough until we challenge directly this cult of austerity and this attachment to public sector wage bill constraints. The eighth area of action, which was really flagged at the Transforming Education Summit, is action on mindsets, and particularly around timeframes. So the problem is that most ministries of finance see education as pure consumption. They think everything you put into education is just spending, because they're only looking at a 3 to 5 year time frame. because that's how the dominant economic model works. Think about a medium-term expenditure framework. Think about 3 to 5 years. And in 3 to 5 years, everything you spend on education is just spending, spending, spending. You're not getting much return. If you take an 8 to 10 year view, investing in education is probably the soundest economic investment that a country could make, because it yields the most clear and systematic and sustained returns on investment in terms of children growing up educated and entering a workforce and contributing to development, contribution to almost every other area of the Sustainable Development Goals, whether health, progress on gender justice, progress on poverty. Education is pivotal, but only if you take that long-term view. And at the moment, countries are caught up in this short-termism, in thinking short-term and seeing education not as investment, but as consumption. We've got to have action on those mindsets. 2 more areas of action. Number 9. And this wasn't explicitly the language in the Transforming Education Summit, but is one which underpins almost all of this. And it is action to decolonize. Because at the moment, we are in a situation where the global financing available for education is shaped more than anything by the policies of the International Monetary Fund, and the decision-making in the International Monetary Fund is controlled by the US. You have to have an 85% majority to change the policies of the IMF, and the US holds 17% of the vote, so they can block anything. The IMF is not a democratic or accountable institution. You can't really do anything to prosecute the IMF or take action against them. There has to be a change, a global change. And the power of the IMF, the voting structure of the IMF, was set after the Second World War, before most countries in Africa were independent. So it's an archaic institution. The voting structure is wrong, and it is nevertheless shaping the financing available for education. So we want to decolonize education financing. We've got to fundamentally change that global financial architecture, both the IMF and also that club of rich nations, the OECD, who have been setting tax rules for the last 60 years. And hopefully that era is coming to an end. But decolonizing education also means looking at a national level and what's happening in countries where increasingly what I'm seeing again and again is national governments, ministries of education, sitting around a table with external donors, with the bilateral and multilateral donors, often working in consortiums, sometimes called local education groups. And they're discussing the future direction of education reform. And even though the donors are bringing relatively small amounts of money compared to the government budget, the direction of reform is shaped in that room in a dialogue with external donors. This is madness. Why are external donors, why do they have the arrogance to think that they know best around what is the best education policy to follow in a country which they often know relatively little about? National education policy should be set in a transparent and accountable way. It should be subject to parliamentary discussion, to new legislation. It cannot be shaped by a 3 to 5 year donor-funded project, which is going to sort of come with all sorts of conditions and ideologies from the donors who always think that they know best, always have the arrogance to think we know better than the national governments and national citizens. That is a really distorted power dynamic. And there has to be a realignment where national governments, in consultation with their own citizens, in their own parliament, in an open and democratic national process, set the direction of reform. And then that if the donors want to come in and support, then that's great. But you can't twist and shape the direction of reform based on a dialogue in closed rooms with a bunch of donors. Decolonizing education, action on decolonization is absolutely fundamental. Part of action for democratization, in fact. The final area of action, which I want to emphasize, is action by youth and students, because this structure that we find ourselves in is as a result of, there's been lots and lots of mobilization on education for many years, but we need new voices, new energy, new direction, and that has to be at absolutely every level. Youth-led organizations and student movements play an absolutely pivotal role in bringing new issues to the table, whether it's at a local level in holding governments to account, or a national level in shifting the nature of the dialogue on education reform, or engaging in regional platforms, or indeed at the global level, and with the emergence of the Global Student Forum, which has been one of the most exciting developments in recent times, so that we have a representative global body that can articulate the voice of students. It is the student and youth-led movements that I think can bring new energy into this call for action, for transformative action, for decolonization. And I'm hugely optimistic that the future of the financing of education is looking much better than the past. And that is going to really be dependent on the collective power and the collective voice of youth and student movements, working with wider organized constituencies and movements. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for now, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, David, so much for sharing these. Definitely, there's a lot of action on decolonizing, action on austerity, action on transforming education, on the debt. And definitely, there is a commitment from the youth and students to actually work and advocate for decolonizing the financing of education. Because as we say in CLARE, it's the education we want. Nothing about us without us. That's been said many times. So I know that there's right now time for any questions that anyone may have. So if any of the persons here have a question, you can write it in the chat, or you can raise your hand or open your mic so we can give you the word for any question. But before that, letting anyone to think about a question. I do have a question, and it can be for any Maria or David, but it's more, and I know it's a very difficult one for you to have an answer, because it's a commitment from the governments, actually, not from us. But what can we do? Because we've heard yesterday and we've heard before today that there's a lot of things going on, but how do we go from just spending most of the budgets on education, on administrative costs, on paying salaries to teachers, and just spending the minimum to actually transform these budgets to respond to the needs that actually students and youth have? And, like, for example, in a region, we have schools that are not being, there's no actually more schools. We need more schools. We need more teachers. We need trained teachers. But everything, it's just spending. Yes, we increase the budget, but just to keep paying salaries, because we need now, we need to raise, for example, the salary for teachers. But how do we go from this to that, and how we as civil society can recommend to governors and decision makers to go from this to actually spend budgets, but not just on this?
So I'm going to jump in very quickly, because I think in every country in the world, even those with good quality universal public education systems, teacher salaries will always be at least 75% of the national budget on education, and sometimes 95%. I don't think that is the problem. I think it's the overall size of the budget in most cases that is the problem. Teachers are the most important thing. The most important determinant for quality of learning, quality of education, is the quality of the teachers. So one of my worries is that we take the teacher workforce for granted, and that we've seen a progressive deprofessionalization and undermining, low paid, finding it difficult to recruit quality teachers. And that's the biggest ingredient that we need. We need to bring down class sizes. What do you need? You need more teachers. We need to improve the quality of training. You need better trained teachers. So teachers are pivotal and central. One of the problems that we face is that the discourse around education reform gets very distorted. National governments pay for the teacher salaries out of their own revenue, usually from the tax revenue that is collected. The donors will never pay for teacher salaries, even though it's 75 to 95% of the budget. The donors never pay for teachers, because governments can't employ a teacher for 2-3 years on a funded project and then not be able to keep them in post afterwards. So the donor dialogue is all about the other things, and gives the illusion that all those other things are more important, because they take the teachers for granted. And that's part of a distortion that happens when you have external donors sitting around a table thinking about what they can do with their money, rather than thinking systemically of what does the system as a whole need. So I'm wary of posing teacher salaries against other costs. I think teacher salaries would always be the bedrock, and we should always be trying to defend getting more teachers and better trained teachers, and in fact make sure teachers have got decent paying conditions. And if we want to ensure that there's other resources, then let's look at increasing the size of the budget overall, not trying to take it from that teacher budget in order to put it somewhere else.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for that. Eric Musiwa has a question. I think he has his raised hand.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Mr. David, for the brilliant presentation, and also Maria for the powerful presentation as well. And thank you for the step that has been shared to us on education financing. Though my interest is on the 10th one, the action to youth and students, I just wanted to understand, normally the youth may have the zeal and the capacity to do that and push or whatever it takes to advance the education in Africa, maybe in our own countries. To the contrary, normally these youth organization, youth-led movements, they may lack the resources, either the approval of funds that can enhance them to raise more awareness, to demand more accountability, to do more advocacy in regards to that. So I don't know how much can we, the youth, be prepared in regards to the way we can take an action, so that at least we are able to voice out, because voicing out is really key. We can start it without resources, but I understand that a certain aspect of the time it's good also for the youth to be given the floor, to be given the resources that can help them to demand the social accountability, to demand or whatever it lacks in the various countries, or either to see the gaps that are there and suggest some other solutions that might help us to at least have a quality of education in Africa. Thank you.
I have lots to say, but Maria, do you want to come in on that?
I beg your pardon?
I was just asking if Maria wanted to go first, but I've got lots of things to say on this topic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
No, David, you go for it. Thank you.
Okay, and so look, I mean, there is a widespread consensus that we need to have youth at the table now in education policy processes, whether nationally, regionally, or globally. I think the most disturbing thing that I see is that it's often incredibly tokenistic, with organizations having youth ambassadors or people who are plucked randomly as youth voices to sit at that table, rather than having youth who are connected with youth-led movements with a clear constituency or student unions. The first fight is to make sure that those people sitting at the table speaking on behalf of youth are genuinely representative and linked to movements, because there's a real danger of tokenism. And what we see with that, so we need to get beyond the tokenism. It's not just about, if we want to have youth voices at the table who are representative, then the people who want to bring those youth voices forward should be supporting those youth-led movements and the student union movement to be able to effectively represent a youth voice. The worry is when it's just plucked random individuals and token ambassadors, the people who are working within that mentality don't have to make any further investments. They're just plucking an individual out and paying for that one person's, so long as they are compliant with the views of the person who is funding them. What we need is something which is much more linked, where the youth voice is representative, has a strong constituencies behind it, and that the work that needs to be done to ensure that that voice is representative is also funded. So it's not just having one person at the table and leaving it at that, making sure that there's a wider support for this. So yes, hugely important. Let's make sure that the voices are supported to do that constituency building work. And I think there's almost every donor, bilateral donor, multilateral donor, foundation, international NGO is now trumpeting the importance of youth voices. But how many of them are actually funding and supporting this in practice in a representative way? Not enough is my answer.
Thank you, David. We will go to Esther, but first we have a question from the chat, which is for Maria, both I think, from Rachel Gondo. She said, please, can Maria provide examples, the first one, examples of gender responsive education service delivery? And the second, how can young people engage in education budget scrutiny, practical ways?
Okay, so I was just like trying to send some of the links. I think, well, one thing that is particularly important for education financing is that every time that children, that families have to pay for education, girls suffer the most. Because when families have, especially low-income families, when they have to choose who to send this to school, they normally choose the firstborn male without disabilities. Right? And so what we saw was that with the abolition of the school fees, when many countries actually implemented free primary education, we saw that there was gender parity, right? Loads of girls suddenly came into school, and this was great, this was fantastic. And now what we are seeing is this discourse of affordability. Education doesn't need to be free anymore. This is what the IMF and the World Bank are saying, what it needs to be affordable, right? This is just so retrogressive because education, like the financing now, is coming from the household, and this is the most regressive way of funding education, and it has a huge gender effect. Now, so how can we make it more gender responsive, more gender transformative? First of all, it has to be free. Second, the teachers need to be properly educated, and part of the professionalization has to be, so they have this gender lens, they understand, right, what girls go through. Another, some of the things that we have been also working with the school is, for instance, issues about period, right, like having your period, so so girls don't stop going because they don't have like sanitary facilities, they don't have sanitary pads, they don't have a spare uniform to get changed into, right? They also need to have like separate toilets, so they don't have any abuse. They also need to be empowered, and they have to have the right mechanisms and structures so they can denounce when they are feeling harassed, right? So there are a lot of ways that we could make it gender transformative in that way, and to ensure that actually girls benefit from education. Because what we see is that for every dollar that we spend, especially as we go along in primary education and secondary education, we are putting a lot more money into the boys than into the girls. And that's because many girls start dropping out of education, right? And we put a lot more money on tertiary education than we put on secondary education and then primary. Another way, which is like gender transformative, is to ensure that there is good quality and free also early childhood and care, because this is particularly transformative for mothers who are able, you know, to work and not to have to be working as in unpaid care. And this goes not only for education, but for other public services, because otherwise women and girls are the ones who are doing all this care work, often unpaid, and they are being like, this is a massive barriers for them to be able to access education. Sorry, and the second question I forgot with all the excitement.
No, it's okay. The second question was, how can young people engage in education budget scrutiny, practical ways?
I really would like you to again attend the toolkit, the launch of the toolkit, and to look more into this, because you can attend, you can engage in many ways from your local level, from your school. You might want to ask more about like, what's the budget that is really in the school. We do this really good participatory exercise of the ideal school, right? What should the ideal school have? What does my school have? Who should be paying for everything that is missing? You could be surprised that many people say the donors should be paying for that, or the families should be paying for that, when it's really the government, right? And then once you do that and you do the full costing of this, you can also use it for advocacy. Now, when the budget is being discussed, and this can happen at local level, but also at national level, you can try to find ways to participate or to ensure that you are inputting with those civil society organizations that can access it. But we all need to be more aware and not to be scared of the budget, not to be scared of economic issues because they are so important, and it's on purpose that they are trying to use this jargon, and then you need to be an economist to understand it. And that's just not true. This is one of those myths that keeps perpetuating this chronic underfunding, together with the myth that it is because we are paying the teachers' salaries that we cannot really fix the schools. It's not a zero-sum game. Right? There are so many myths that are perpetuating this, honestly, chronic underfunding, and we really need to fight against them because education is the soundest investment that anyone can make. And it's not only an investment, it's a human right. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Esther, now you have.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you, David and Maria, for those brilliant presentations. It even also just shows the passion that you speak with. I have a very short question, and it's directed to David. And I want to pick your mind on the decolonizing of education itself before we even start talking about decolonizing education financing, right? And on top of that, as students and youth, we are coming from organizations at different levels, be it at national level, regional level, continental, or even global. And there's a lot of tokenism that you have also reflected on. And I want us to move away from just sloganing, right? We keep saying nothing for us without us. Down with commodification of education, but honestly, that doesn't translate to policy positions, that doesn't translate to the radical implementations on the ground. So perhaps it's just to ask or seek for advice as different students and youth leaders representing the constituencies that have given us all these mandates to speak and to be a voice of reason. What more beyond advocacy can we do to ensure that we do decolonize education, and we also move towards decolonizing education financing?
So look, this is a very, very big topic, but it is absolutely right that we've got to look at decolonizing education itself. The very framing and conception of education is largely a sort of Western liberal model. The nature of the curriculum, how the curriculum is structured, the language that is used, even down to the sort of images that are used, often deeply rooted in a sort of racist worldview. There has to be a much wider process of radically rethinking the curriculum, radically thinking about the sort of cosmology and worldview that is embedded in education systems, particularly important for Indigenous communities. But I think looking at systematically addressing anti-racism through education and challenging discrimination at every level. Education systems at the moment sometimes reinforce the injustice and inequalities in the societies that surround the school. And I think it should be the absolute central imperative of schools to be contesting that injustice and inequality in the wider community. And that means radically rethinking the curriculum, radically rethinking inclusion in every single stage and the sort of model of education. So yes, decolonizing the financing of education is part of a wider project of decolonizing of education. But let's be clear, until we have decolonized education financing, we are going to be in a situation where the power to set the direction of education reform is disproportionately handed to a bunch of external actors who are going to reinforce the existing education model. So actually decolonizing the financing is part of reclaiming, part of a democratizing process, which creates the space for a deeper decolonization of education as a whole. So I think decolonizing financing is a great entry point. It starts framing the big picture of what is possible, starts reclaiming decision-making power where it should be. And then there needs to be a much more sustained and extended project. For me, reference at the beginning, the founding ideas of education in all of the work that I do come from the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, that at the moment, education is always a choice in every school, in every classroom, in every system, between education for domestication or education for liberation. And any model which is based on teachers knowing everything and textbooks creating a sort of monologue undermines education for liberation. We need to create dialogue. We need dialogue in the classroom, but we also need dialogue, serious and proper, well-balanced dialogue in education policy processes and financing decisions as well. So I see these things as intimately connected.
Thank you so much, David and Maria, for this first part of the session. I'm very happy that the conversation is flowing and everyone has a lot of questions, and I know that questions will be continuing to happen. But I will now allow the second part of this conversation, and I know that maybe you have questions that the next panelist may have the answer for that. So I will now let it with my colleague, Corel. She will be moderating the second part of the session. So Corel, I will now hand it to you.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Diana. So I am Kazi Karel, representing ANSEFA in the GCA Youth Action Group. And as Diana rightly said, I'll be taking us through this section of our agenda. But before we start, if you're as excited and as glad as I am, please drop in the comments an emoji that shows the way you're feeling about these conversations we're having right now. And so we're moving to our next presentation. Thank you, Rachel. We'll be calling on Prince Gideon Olanrewaju, and sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. So Gideon is a Nigerian educational development practitioner and digital development researcher with over 8 years of international experience, spanning 4 countries, working on initiatives that democratize access to digital learning and revolutionize educational content delivery for millions of Nigerian children. He currently serves as the Chief Executive Director of Aid for Rural Education Access Initiative, a community-based nonprofit organization he founded in 2014, which has grown across the nation, impacting 45,047 beneficiaries in 33 communities across 15 states through quality alternative formal and non-formal educational programs based on digital literacy, foundational skill development, girls' education, and transition from school to work. So Prince Gideon will be entertaining us on government policy recommendations in transforming education financing and decolonizing education systems and the role of youth organizations in this. So Prince Gideon, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Karel. I'm not sure if I pronounced that rightly. And thank you so much to David and the other doctor from LSU spoke earlier. I learned greatly from your presentation. My perspective to the topic or title that I've been given would be of that of a practitioner and somewhat that of a scholar as well. I was able to read and digest the policy recommendations that came from the Transforming Education Summit in New York last year. And I would say 3 things stands out on how I believe, the government policy recommendations can be interpreted in, from a decolonization lens and the role of young people or youth as well. So 3 fundamental things that I would talk about on as part of my contribution. The first thing would be, equitable allocation and management of financial resources. The second would be outcome-based financing or performance-driven funding. And the last one would be alternative financing instruments and non-traditional financing mechanisms. So I'm going to talk about each of these, thematic topics, and then, contribute what I believe should be the role of young people or youth organizations. So a key outcome from, the government policy recommendation from TERS is the need to increase public investment, particularly or basically the allocation of a larger portion of national budgets to education. I believe this is important, but not only is this important, equitable allocation is what matters. And the interpretation I give to that, from an angle of trying to understand, decolonizing, our educational system is to ensure ensure, for example, that there's an increase in the percentage of educational investment going to, let's say, 40 to 20% of families that are, from the lowest income, backgrounds to those living in rural or distant areas, including children with disabilities or those who are vulnerable. It is one thing to increase financial investment through national budgets, going by UNESCO's, recommendation of, between 20 to 25% or more. But it's also important that those resources are actually equitably allocated and, fiscally, transparently mobilized for the use of educational systems. Now, I believe that the role of young people or youth organizations in this equitable allocation will definitely be for them to institutionalize accountability mechanisms that would not only drive fiscal transparency, but will also ensure some sort of adequate management of these resources from local levels to the national levels. As we have seen, young people or youth organizations can and should mobilize or coordinate online and offline advocacy actions. And a huge example is what, a youth-led organization in Nigeria, for example, called Budget does by presenting or submitting freedom of information requests to ministries to ensure and hold government accountable and making sure that financial resources prioritizing spendings on, for example, professional development opportunities for teachers, curriculum development, and educational technology, or generally cost-effective interventions such as structured pedagogy that has basic evidence to show that it works in transforming educational outcomes. So increase or ensure equitable allocation of financial resources, and youth organizations can drive these through accountability mechanism to ensure fiscal transparency. That's the first one. The second one would be driving a new regime of outcome-based financing or performance-driven funding. I think I took that, or I interpreted that as one of the key recommendations from the TEST Summit. And I think many governments in Africa do not currently operate on that kind of a principle. By leveraging the principle of outcome-based financing, I believe that educational financing systems within African countries or generally in the world can become more efficient, equitable, which will lead to improved educational outcomes for students and a more effective use of public and private resources. So what is basically outcome-based financing or performance-driven funding, or RBF, as it might invariably called? It would simply mean shifting focus from inputs, which a lot of governments seem to focus on, right now, which is, how can we improve, enrollment rates? How can we provide physical infrastructure, which no doubt is also very, very much important in transforming, academic achievement rates and, learning indicators. But it needs to go to more measurable outcomes, such as, student learning outcomes, graduation rates, employment outcomes, and post-educational success. And there is clearly a function that I believe youth organizations can, do to ensure this recommendation of institutionalizing outcome-based funding can become, can lead to transformative financing across all educational levels in countries. And that would be that there is a need for youth organizations to mobilize their expertise in supporting or collaborating with government institutions so that they can build capacity in terms of data collection or analysis to be able to measure outcomes accurately. That will be post deployment of such a system, or even before identifying the areas of improvements that can actually make use of better resource allocation, which is based on evidence of effectiveness. That's the second one. And that's the way I think youth-led organizations can function in that new regime. The last one, which it was clearly stated, and I think David also, spoke about it briefly as well as the first speaker, and I think it's very much expressive through the work of, the advocacy that ActionAid does as well, is the need for us to, heighten the sense of awareness of our government on alternative financing instrument or generally non-traditional financing mechanisms. It is clear, or evidence shows, or data shows that over 97% of finance comes from domestic sources, and shifting attention could potentially be a critical step in decolonizing the whole understanding of education financing. And this is where I personally believe that, alternative and innovative financing partnership matters. It is clear that, there's evidence to show from, the World Bank, for example. There's a popular economist that talks about the effectiveness of, for example, diaspora bonds, and countries like India and Israel have over time leveraged this very interesting tool to mobilize sustainable finance for, infrastructural development locally. And I think if we talk about innovative financing that can also be leveraged for educational development in a decolonized approach, it could potentially be, non-traditional financing mechanisms like diaspora bonds or remittances. And youth organizations have shown to have, the creative mileage, such as, the use of technology to be able to encourage and inform their governments on how such a very interesting tool or tools, if it is not diaspora bonds, for example, but many other ones like, social impact bonds. And, there are quite a number of examples of, alternative financing instruments. And I think many governments do not realize the potential or the significance of these in complementing local budgetary allocations. And what we can do as youth organizations predominantly will be to not only raise awareness on the significance of these instruments, but also to provide, maybe technical expertise in mobilizing or leveraging such instruments for use. So in a recap, 3 things: there needs to be equitable allocation and management of financial resources, and that can be done through, institutionalizing accountability mechanisms. There's a, continuous need for local education systems to adopt, an outcome or performance-driven approach, just to ensure that, there is a clear measure in between allocating, financing and the results that we're getting at the end. And the last one will be the leveraging on alternative financing instruments and non-traditional financing mechanisms. I would be glad to respond to more questions if there is, anything that I've mentioned that will need more clarification. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prince Gideon, for this interesting presentation. So what we can retain from your presentation is that there is a need for equitable allocation and management of financial resources. There is a need to focus on performance-driven approach, and then the need to resort to non-traditional financing mechanism, and that youths, as we know, are very versed and creative when it comes to the use of tech tools, and that they need to put it into application in order to ensure proper decolonization of education. Please, I will call on us to post any questions or inquiries we have for Gideon in the chat, and we will have a slot for question and answers where he could answer to any of our preoccupations. So right now we will be moving to another presentation, GC and youth engagement, and we will be giving the floor to Tajuddin Habib Adewale, who is Senior Program Officer for Brain Builders Youth Development Initiative. Habib is an impact-driven development enthusiast with 5 years of experience working in development advocacy, project management, research and data analysis, peace and conflict resolution, and public service management. A young professional with a strong track record demonstrating leadership, leading teams, and mobilizing action aimed at actualizing the sustainable development goals. Highly skilled at rethinking project implementation, strategies to optimize outcomes, and instill sustainability in results. He's passionate about sustainable development, quality and affordable education, technology innovation, set-up building, and policy making, and has served as a member of important government committees responsible for policy planning for edutech projects in Nigeria. Habib, please, we're listening to your presentation on GC and youth engagement.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen so that you can just, yeah, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. So let me just, good afternoon, everyone. So I will be very quick and fast so that we can't keep people waiting. So today I'll just be speaking, trying to leverage on what other participants has been discussing so far. So talking about the GCE and how we can actually improve the youth engagement through the works of which Global Campaign for Education has been doing in different localities. So without wasting much of our time, most of the focus of GCE, as we rightly actually know, which I classify in my own classification into 4 different aspects, which is capacity development, funding, collaborations, and enabling platforms. So these are the way which GCE has been trying to actually support youth-led organizations to ensure that there is a more localizations of ideas and improvement in some in work they do at different local areas. So based on what GCE has been, so if we can actually see how we can actually improve on this work. So these are some of the recommendations I've actually come up with. Just one is that I would actually say that just like GCE has this student constituency, but where input has been respected from this student constituency, I would advise if GCE can actually find a way to incorporate representative of youth constituency as well into our board, where we have youth constituency different from the student constituency. I think this will actually give room for other strata to also find a way to contribute to the development of the organization and what the organization do at different localities. So another one is GCE can actually improve in capacity building for its youth action group. So I think one of the way GCE can actually improve is ensuring that there is a way they actually expand the capacity building of its JAG member, either through education fellowships or internship opportunity at GCE, where people can actually expand their tentacles and be able to actually learn more things and gain more on-job experience, which, by the way, it's actually improving the capacity of individuals that are within the GCE community. Another thing I will actually talk about is GCE giving opportunities for youth and students for global opportunities spotlight, such like the high-level political forum events, United General Assembly events, and other things, where if GCE can actually promote more youth to actually have access to this opportunity. Because one of the challenges I can say most youth are actually facing in this contemporary is that even if there are a lot of opportunity out there, the accessibility to this opportunity is one of the challenges that's actually reducing the impact and the way the youth can actually develop. If GCE can actually find a way to democratize access to opportunities, where youth and students can actually have more access to international opportunities to actually advance in what they do and actually develop their personal and career goal. So another one which I can actually, another recommendation which I can actually come up with, GCE should work on gamification of some of their education policy, because I can actually say that because GCE is actually doing well in actually localizing some of this, many of their projects. Like even I can actually give accolades to what they are doing in Nigeria with the projects that they are funding Green Leadership Development Initiative to on democratizing ideas and trying to set up state actors across about 30 states in Nigeria, where edutech advocacy is being championed across all these states. But what I would just say is that more of what GCE can do is that if because of the nature of the generation we're actually dealing with at the moment, let me just say the Gen Z, if GCE can actually find a way to get put idea of gamifications where they have access to all these materials, maybe like puzzles or games on the social, maybe on the app stores, and all those different stores, they can actually get this thing and give a kind of knowledge building for these youth. So it's like a way trying to actually promoting the knowledge, and at the same time trying to create a way to actually advance what the organization is doing. So being said this, I can actually say most of work of GCE, most of the work GCE had actually done in the past, which to me, I see it as one of special thing that even if many other organizations can actually adopt this, it will actually go a long way. One of the things is that giving the rooms for organizations to actually put some of the advocacy into local languages, where advocacy materials are not just being shared based on the normal language we know, either English but giving room to languages like maybe Yoruba language, Hausa language, and these are one of the great things that EGC has been doing. And if they can actually champion trying to encourage other organizations that are actually doing great things around education and advancing youth-led organization in promoting education, if they can actually influence other organizations to do this as well, I think it will go a long way in promoting the good work the Global Campaign for Education is doing. So being said this, I think that's all I have to contribute to this. So if there is any question or any other contribution from any other participant, I'm open for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abi, for this very beautiful presentation. Thank you for calling on GC to take action in specific areas which we identify. And now I would like to you called on GCE to incorporate youth and youth constituencies as it is done for student constituencies. But I think that the Youth Action Group takes into account youths and students, and it's not only students. You equally called on GC to improve the capacity building of Youth Action Group members. You, through education fellowships and internship at GCE, you equally are calling on GC to recommend youths for spotlight opportunities, because sometimes we have these opportunities, but we need recommendation or backup from someone to be able to participate, and it would be great that GC could step in. And then you calling on GC once more to help to put advocacy materials in local languages, because we know that most of us have local languages, and that some of us are trying to make sure that our voices are heard in the languages that people hear the most. So thank you very much for calling on us on these very brilliant points. Right now, we will be moving on to the question and answer sessions. And please, if you have any questions addressed to Abi, please, you can raise your hand or put them up in the chat, and we will answer to them. Right now, we will be going through to the question. The question was addressed to Prince Gedeon in the chat. By Ephraim. I think I'm reading it right. So the question goes thus: how can the youth be involved in financial expenditure and financial monitoring mechanisms? Please, Gedeon.
Thank you, Carol. So I would attempt to respond to that based on how I've interpreted the question, how young people can get engaged in financial expenditure, particularly how it applies to education financing, particularly on, local scene. One thing that I'm familiar with that is done well in Nigeria, for example, is before budgets are being passed, there is something called public hearing that is being, made open by the House of Assembly or House of Representatives. And there are always open public hearings that give members of the public the opportunity to come into a room and perhaps question a budget line or budget costs allocated to, education, for example. one of the things that many organizations have been talking about over the last few years since the adoption of the SDGs is the need to promote gender transformative, education or gender transformative financing within local education systems. And a good example of a way, one can mainstream gender transformation or gender responsive, policy into the budgeting, for example, is when you go for a public hearing, for example, and you see that there is no budget costs or budget lines that are particularly, allotted to, let's say, recruitment of female teachers or the provision of water, sanitation, and hygiene within schools that impacts on girls' education. That is a very good example of a typical way that I believe, that can be done. In Nigeria as well, there are lots of young individuals who have built, global accountability tools. A huge example is something called the public procurement platform. It was built by a young person who takes, government documents on financing, now upload them on the public portal for young people to have access to them. When you go on a portal like that and you download this document, you are able to, interpret them based on what you know, and then you can mount on, any form of public or private advocacy plan that you may have in pushing to ensure, what is allotted to one thing is, is judiciously spent. The last one is also about a youth movement. There is a popular organization in Nigeria called Follow the Money. And what they do is to work with local communities and raising awareness. Many communities do not know, for example, 2 million naira has been provided for the construction of a two classroom block in their cities or in their villages. By ensuring that they raise awareness with the community members, these community members are able to take their public office holders accountable to ensure that constituency financing provided for the provision of public institutional infrastructure is actually being provided. All of these are very good examples of how I know that young people in Nigeria, for example, have been able to engage with financial expenditure processes and ensure they can hold government officials and key stakeholders accountable to ensuring transformative financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prince Gedeon. Thank you for these clear answers. And yes, I've heard about Follow the Money, and I think it's a concept I like very much about this group, Follow the Money. The first time I heard about it, I was like, wow, this is good. We are getting the government accountable for what they say, and that does not just remain words, but we have actions going with it. So for the next part, please, guys, if you have other questions, you can post them in the chat, and then the concerned will provide answers for you in the chat. Right now, we have to be moving on, and I'll be handing the floor over to Diana for the next part.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, so if you have questions, you can leave them in the chat, and maybe the panelists can also be answering those questions in the chat as well. So now we will move on to Ziad Abu-Wazim, who will be talking about learning and skills for life and work, financing education for post-tertiary education. Ziad is a Jordanian architect. He's a youth and union activist, member of the youth group of the Arab Campaign for Education for All ASEA. He's certified training at the Arab Network for Civic Education and a chairman and member of several professional and national committees in the Jordanian Engineering Association. And he's member of a youth initiative to advocate for the education loss of students in Jordan. So Ziad, we will leave it to you now. Thank you.
شكرا، مساء الخير جميعا. شكرا لهذه الفرصة للتواصل. رح نتحدث اليوم عن تعليم ما بعد الجامعي، التعليم المستمر. رح أشارك معكم البرزنتيشن. يعني headlines presentation. وراح نبلش، وأي أسئلة في نهاية العرض أنا جاهز. بداية نقطة الانطلاق لمداخلتي هي مسارات العمل لقمة تحويل التعليم، وتحديدا مسار العمل الثاني. مسار العمل الثاني اللي هو التعلم والمهارات من أجل الحياة والعمل والتنمية المستدامة. نظرا لأنه هذا المسار يشكل أولوية للشباب العربي، حيث لا تنتهي متاعب الشباب العربي عند انتهاء الحياة الجامعية، ولكن فعليا تبدأ التحديات الحقيقية. فمنلاحظ بنلاحظ احنا انه في عندنا مراكز علميه متاخره لمعظم الجامعات العربيه في الدول متوسطه الدخل رغم ارتفاع كلفه التعليم. مع ارتفاع درجه الوعي لدى الشعب العربي باهميه التعليم واثره على تقدم المجتمع، نلاحظ ارتفاع نسبه المتعلمين الحاصلين على الشهاده الجامعيه. فالشباب في معظم الدول العربية باتوا متعلمين وحاصلين على شهادات جامعية، وأصبحنا نرى نماذج نيرة لعقول عربية شابة متميزة في ريادة الأعمال وإبداعات تعدت حدود المنطقة إلى العالمية. رغم كل ذلك للأسف فإن الطابع العام في السنوات الأخيرة هو التكديس الممنهج لخريجي الجامعات بشهادات في مختلف التخصصات دون ربط في سوق العمل وحاجاته، وتكاد تكون هذه مشكلة عالمية بين الشباب في مختلف التخصصات، حيث تشير تقديرات منظمة العمل الدولية إلى أن معدل بطالة الشباب في عام 2020 بلغ 17.2% مقابل 6.6% من إجمالي القوى العاملة. وقد تفاقمت هذه التفاوتات في النسب بسبب آثار جائحة كوفيد-19 اللي عطل الكثير من الشباب والبالغين فضلا عن رفاههم العقلي والمالي والاجتماعي. فبالعودة لخريجين الجامعات، فغالبا الجامعات في الدول العربية متوسطة الدخل في مراكز متأخرة حسب التصنيفات العالمية، والسبب الرئيسي اللي عم بيكون رغم كلفة التعليم العالي في عندنا نقص في التمويل والإنفاق على التعليم، وهذا بيأثر على جودة ونوعية هذه المخرجات. فكثير من خطط الجامعات لم يجري أي تنقيح لها منذ عقود، ففي تخصصات يعني مشبعة ولا زالت تستقبل الكثير من الطلاب سنويا، وأخرى تعطي مساقات أكل الدهر عليها وشرب. يعني لا يوجد أي تحديث ومواكبة في الخطط الجامعية في معظم الجامعات، وكأن التعليم الجامعي أصبح يتناسب فرديا مع ارتفاع نسب البطالة، فتجد فرص العمل المتاحة للحرفيين والمهنيين غير المتعلمين أكبر منها لأصحاب الشهادات نظرا لضعف السوق وزيادة العرض وقلة الطلب. وحتى لا يفهم الكلام بشكل سلبي، وإنه إحنا لا ندعو لوقف التعليم العالي أو العزوف عن الشهادات الجامعية، بل إنه جل حديثنا يتمحور حول تحسين جودة ونوعية التعليم. ففي كافة مراحل التعليم يجب أن يكون تركيز تمويل التعليم على تطويره ورفع الجودة. فالسوق العالمي اليوم لم يعد كالسابق، وما يريده رب العمل من أي متقدم للوظيفة هو المهارة التي يتقنها المتقدم وليس ما هو على الورق. فسوق العمل الآن هو لمن يبدي القدرة على الإبداع والابتكار بعيداً عن الشهادات الورقية المروجة، ولا يكون هذا إلا بتحسين مخرجات التعليم الجامعي وما بعد الجامعي، واللي راح نلخصها في مجموعة من التوصيات. من توصياتنا اللي خرجت بعد جهد مع مجموعات شبابية كانت إعادة النظر في الخطط الجامعية وإدراج مساقات تطبيقية عملية تكسب الطلب المهارات التي يحتاجها سوق العمل، إعداد وتفعيل برنامج للتواصل المستدام بين الجامعات وخريجيها عن طريق تقديم الدورات المستمرة والتعليم المتواصل لمواكبة التطورات العالمية ورفع كفاءة الخريجين، وهذا لا يكون إلا بزيادة الإنفاق على التعليم ضمن الموازنات الرسمية، وتخصيص هذا الإنفاق لتطوير جودة التعليم، حيث أننا في المنطقة كما تفضل الزملاء سابقا نعاني أيضا من أن معظم ميزانيات التعليم هي تذهب إلى رواتب، ولا تذهب هذه الأموال لتحسين جودة ونوعية التعليم. أيضا من توصياتنا تفعيل شراكة حقيقية مع القطاع الخاص تضمن حصول الطلبة بعد تخرجهم على تدريب حقيقي وفعلي يكسبهم المهارات والخبرات المطلوبة في ظل الضغط الهائل. لا تستطيع أي حكومة إنجاز هذا العمل دون تضافر جميع الجهود. تفعيل دور النقابات المهنية وتواصلها مع الجامعات لتعديل خططها والتنسيق المشترك معها، كونها الأكثر قدرة على معرفة احتياجات السوق المحلي، وبالتالي استحداث الخطط والمسارات التي من شأنها سد الفجوة بين الخريجين وسوق العمل، وزيادة ميزانيات التدريب لدى النقابات المهنية بحيث يغطي أعداد أكبر من الخريجين على أن يكون التدريب نوعي وليس كمي. أيضا من توصياتنا استحداث برامج تدريبية وتأهيل للخريجين بخطط واضحة تهدف لإيجاد فرص عمل في الخارج في أسواق واعدة. حاليا العالم كله يتجه إلى بعض الأسواق، خلينا نحكي الأسواق غير التقليدية، هاي الأسواق التي بحاجة إلى خبرات ومهارات شابة. فعلى جميع الدول التي يعاني شبابها من البطالة التفكير في موضوع الأسواق الواعدة. أيضا توصياتنا كانت دعم القطاع الخاص عن طريق تخفيض الضرائب مقابل تدريب وتأهيل الخريجين ورفع كفاءتهم، وربط إلزام نسبة معينة من المتدربين مربوطة برأس مال الشركة وطبيعة عملها. تفعيل دور هيئة الاعتماد للتعليم العالي الجامعي بحيث تمارس دورها في الرقابة على مخرجات التعليم وضمان جودتها من خلال الالتزام بنسب أعداد الطلاب إلى هيئة التدريس. وتفعيل امتحان الكفاءة وانعكاساته على تصنيف الجامعات وربطه بالسماح لها باستحداث المزيد من التخصصات. أيضا موضوع استثمارات الجامعات، تنويع الاستثمار لضمان مصادر دخل أكثر لدى الجامعات، مما يعني يحد من اعتمادها على التمويل الخارجي أو الحكومي. وتفعيل دور وزارة التعليم العالي للتوأمة مع التوأمة بين الجامعات الحكومية وجامعات عالمية ذات مخرجات متميزة. وأيضا أريد قبل أن أختم يعني في إضاءة بسيطة على تقرير اليونسكو الأخير إعادة تصور مستقبلنا معا، الذي شدد على الحاجة إلى تطوير نهج على نطاق المنظومة لتحويل التعليم لتطوير ودعم قدرات الشباب والكبار وتزويدهم بالمعرفة والمهارات والقيم الضرورية. كما سيحتاج التعليم إلى إعادة تصور وإعادة إنشاء اقتصادات ومجتمعات أكثر عدلا واستدامة في عالم يتزايد فيه عدم اليقين وعدم القدرة على التنبؤ. هذا الأمر يتطلب العمل بشكل حثيث ومباشر مع كافة المعنيين، بما في ذلك المؤثرين على المستوى العالمي والإقليمي والوطني، مع العمل بشكل مباشر مع الشباب كشركاء لإدماجهم في عملية تنموية شمولية تتضمن تمكين جميع المتعلمين من تحقيق الرفاهية ومستقبل العمل واستدامة كوكب الأرض. شكرا لكم، مساءكم سعيد.
Thank you so much, Ziad, for that presentation. Definitely, I'm sorry, I'm just letting out the interpretation. Definitely, it's very important about what you mentioned. There is a lack of actually not employment, but we have the need of more employees. But the thing is that we don't have the capacities, or the youth and students are not being trained well to access the work, the labor work we need. So actually we will move on because we are a little bit over time. Now we will move on to the policy recommendations to governments that we have from our colleague, Dr. Esther Simon. She's part of the YAG, also from GCE. She currently serves as the Secretary General for the Southern African Student Union, which is a regional body for student unions within the SADC, representing all 16 member states. Dr. Simon further served as the 17th and the first female president of the Namibian National Students Organization, on All African Student Union's Constitutional Review Committee member, founder of Joy Rice Private Academy, and a firm access to education activist. Dr. Simon is passionate about education, community development, public policy, and social justice. She is a board member for the GCE under the Youth and Students. She served as the youngest presidential advisor on the high-level panel on the Namibian economy to His Excellency President Dr. H, appointed by His Excellency to advise and formulate a blueprint on strategic solutions to revive the Namibian economy. She recently conferred as honorary doctorate degree from the Haim Welges University from Benin Republic. She was awarded also by the African Youth Awards on the 100 Most Influential Young Africans in 2018. So she will now be presenting the policy recommendations to governments.
Thank you very much, Diana. Good afternoon to everyone once again. I'll just quickly want to share my screen. Okay, I trust and hope we can all see that. Can I get a thumbs up?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, perfect. So I'll try to be very brief, also noting that we are running out of time. My role this afternoon is to really look in terms of the role that governments play in decolonizing education as a whole, as well as decolonizing education financing. I tried to firstly contextualize decolonizing education from my own perspective. And I must say, just looking at what the previous speakers have said, it's everyone trying to really contextualize it from their own perspective, from their own understanding. And much of it would not even really dwell on the definition in itself. After contextualizing, I'll then try to dive quickly into the role that governments ought to be playing in decolonizing education, as well as education financing, and then briefly also highlight on the policy recommendation, both from youth and student perspective, and the call to action that is being chanted from the youth and student constituency to all governments during this given Gawa week and also moving forward. Now, in terms of decolonizing education per se, and this is a deliberate attempt where I felt zoning also closer to the question that I asked David, is to say, I feel we can't really just talk about decolonizing education financing and avoiding, or not really avoiding, but also leaving room for much larger interpretation on also decolonizing education. Because before we can also decolonizing the financial aspect, we need to look at the quality, or rather the education that we are receiving as a whole, be it in the African context, in the European context, whichever it is, because gone are the days when we had a lot of colonial aspects, and much of these colonial legacies have honestly left a big print within the education system, and we need to do away with these colonial structures that have continued to shape the education or educational systems that we are getting, the curriculum in itself, their practices, and so forth. You would find that within the African context, for example, much of the education that we receive is really informed from the colonial era, is informed from the apartheid regime. I am maybe to be specific, and even the language that I'm speaking right now is a colonizer's language, but be it that in as much as I understand the importance of us having a common language that speaks to us being able to understand one another. In the process, there's still a need for us to be able to hold firm to our mother tongue, to hold firm to our indigenous knowledge that we have. So it's honestly just the aspect of us trying to contextualize what decolonizing education is before we move broader to then talking about decolonizing education financing. So That's honestly where this slide is coming from. Now, looking into the essence of my presentation today is to look into a larger scope in terms of the role of government. And I still looked at it from two perspectives: role of government specifically with regards to decolonizing education, and also their role with regards to decolonizing education financing. Very firstly and briefly is around curriculum reform. The need for us to reform our curriculum, be it whichever context that we find ourselves, because I believe, or rather there's a firm need to ensure that the educational materials continues to reflect of a more inclusive and a more diverse perspective, right? You would find that, and this is another example within the African context, for instance, we do have African solutions for African problems, but you'd find that within the curriculums, the education system that we have here doesn't most of the time really reflect on the current demands within our own African contexts, or any context in a different space where there has been a colonial reform or a colonial contribution towards that education that's given within that scope. It's much easier when, for example, a learner, be it in high school context or even in university, is able to reflect to an example that is tried to be explained even in their mother tongue as compared to it being explained within the English context. Now, giving Namibia as an example, Namibia is a German colony, and we've also been colonized by the Boer. You would find that within our schooling system, English is your first language, German is your second language, or Afrikaans, and then your mother tongue becomes your third language. Now, within that aspect itself is diminishing the value of our own mother tongue. And there's other aspects that contribute to even this official language that is shoved down onto learners, right? Sometimes the local language or your mother tongue has an influence on this different language. For example, there's a lot of within my mother tongue. You would find that somebody from my dialect would pronounce red robot, for instance, like lead robot. And the discrimination that comes with that is your intellectual capacity is measured on how good you can speak English, how good you can understand, how good you can pronounce these given words. And honestly, for me, it goes beyond just reforming the curriculum. It also goes deeper to a shift within the mindset, and also looking into the importance of acknowledging the colonial history. We can't continue to, many years after colonialization, still be talking or still be having a conversation on decolonizing education, still be having a conversation on decolonizing education financing. I feel there's a little bit of direct intervention that needs to happen within our governments to acknowledge that, yes, it did happen, right? But 30, 40 years later, we still can't be having a pre-conversation. It ought to have been advanced by now. Now, in that given acknowledgement will then come the need to create direct interventions, which speaks to the next slide. Role still that government needs to play with regards to indigenous language preservation, which I think I've highlighted within the first curriculum review aspect. Would like then move on to the one that speaks to funding and resource allocation. Right. I'd like to reference David's presentation where he highlighted on the, I think, 6 actions that were taken at a TESS conference last year. Now, much of these actions that are taken at TESS speaks to action that needs to be taken on debt, action that needs to be taken on tax, for instance. But I would want our interventions from youth and students to honestly reflect at country level. Before we even take a holistic approach and a holistic understanding of what needs to be done globally, what needs to be done regionally, we need to come closer to our national perspective or the national level to say, do our governments allocate sufficient budget to education? If they don't, which many don't, what then needs to happen, right? Now, looking closer to the role that government needs to do, sufficient funding. But what becomes the status quo is there is a high increase in commodification of education. There's a high privatization of education. And many times as youth and students, as youth leaders, as student leaders, ours remain the chance, ours remain advocacy for access to quality, relevant education, but still free education within our lifetime. But then with this free education that we are chanting for, within this free education that we are advocating for, it's an education that needs to be decolonized, an education that needs sufficient funding, an education that needs direct intervention that speaks to decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing the financing, decolonizing everything that has to do with the colonial legacies, to decompose it, to ensure that the current education that we do receive is relevant to our context, has more of our indigenous knowledge, and has also sufficient funding in that regard. The last role that I feel is very, very sufficient and is just to reflect on revisiting assessments and evaluation methods, right? And I would want to give Namibia again as an example, and maybe other African countries or any other country that might have been colonized, and the education that they are getting currently doesn't speak to their own context. Here in Namibia, the final examination that we write before we can proceed to university is Cambridge, right? And we all know that Cambridge is either the UK, fine. Now, you would find that a child or a learner from Namibia that is either from a rural area, to be specific, is not exposed to the same that I that grew up in the city, for instance, would be exposed to. Neither would I equally be exposed to the same that a learner that is in the UK is exposed to, be it on house chores, be it on the quality of education that we're receiving, be it on the atmosphere and the conducive schooling environment that we have, right? But on top of that, we are subjected to the same examination. We are subjected to the same assessments and evaluation. What does that then make it? It makes it very unfair. It doesn't bring out the equity aspect that we continue to advocate for. What then happens is that the learner in the rural school would not perform as good as I that is in the city will perform. Neither will I that is in the city perform as good as a learner within the UK context, right? Because of the different exposures that we have, because of the different atmospheres, the different standards that has been imposed on us. So I feel it's about time. When we talk about decolonizing education financing, we need to also look deeper in terms of assessments, in terms of evaluation, and really ensure that our governments play critical roles in ensuring that there is a radical shift, not only with the budgets that they are allocating to education, but also within the systems and the type of education that we are receiving within this context. Now, interventions and policy recommendations on two counts again. One very practical on decolonizing education, and then the other three on decolonizing education financing. Very, very straightforward, inclusive curriculum framework, teacher training and professional development. This, I think, also took center stage during David's presentation, as well as Maria's presentation. And I can't overemphasize the importance of ensuring that when we are decolonizing education financing, when we are decolonizing education, even the trainings that our teachers and professional development that happens needs to be decolonized. Because now, within our universities framework, the curriculum there speaks to the colonial education systems that we have, right? So when we need to decompose, even as far as curriculums within our universities as well. A third intervention would be equitable resource allocations. We need policies which ensure equitable distribution of financial resources for education, with specific focus on addressing historical disparities faced by indigenous communities. Funding and resource allocation, which then speaks to resource support of implementation of decolonizing education initiatives. And I wanted this to be last deliberately because many a times we highlight so much on policy intervention, policy recommendations, this needs to happen. We are crafting documents back and forth. But what happens to these policy recommendations? What happens to these documents that we are crafting over and over? They go and they collect dust in our ministerial offices, in government official offices, and they don't see the light of day during implementation phase. Now, I do not want the same discussion on decolonizing financing to continue being a slogan, to continue being a theme, either for Gawa Week or for TESS conferences. But when it comes to radical implementation, we continue to select, like many other approaches. We've been talking about free education for all. How many policies have we created for free education? Within so many contexts in Africa, for example, very few countries provide free education, and that's even just at primary level. Secondary education is still not free. Tertiary education, there's a high commodification, privatization, where the less privileged continue to be shut down and continue to be disadvantaged from accessing education at that level. But then where do we find ourselves drawing back to where do we find ourselves? We go back to the drawing table, still discuss about policies and not discuss about implementation. But implementation also continues to then be without the last one, accountability and monitoring, right? We implement sometimes, yes, but who monitors how radical this implementation was done? Who monitors whether it speaks to the current demands and the changing times? Who holds who accountable? As NGOs, as civil societies, as youth and students from our different student organizations or youth-led organizations, how do we hold our governments accountable? In as much as we continue to recommend, we continue to give interventions, the shift needs to come from talking about decolonizing education, talking about decolonizing education financing, to more of an approach on how to implement the strategies to decolonize, because conversations can't continue just being conversations, discussions can't continue just being discussions without tangible a reflection on the reality, what is on the ground, and implementation thereof. Now, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to move to the call to action. This call to action is crafted on behalf of the youth and students of Global Campaign for Education. And it reads as follows. We, the young people, call upon our governments to prioritize decolonizing education and transforming education financing. We believe that education should be inclusive, equitable, and representative of our diverse cultures and histories. We urge you to interrogate indigenous knowledge into the curriculum, challenge dominant narratives, and provide comprehensive teacher training on cultural competency. Additionally to that, we ask for equitable resource allocation to address historical disparities, support indigenous education, and ensure that no student is left behind. It is time to empower young voices, bridge educational gaps, and create a brighter future for all. We say, let's decolonize education today. Let's decolonize education financing. The time is now and the time is right. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I so submit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esther. I feel like clapping for you. Thank you for sharing these recommendations that we all have had. Like, I'm very much interested in changing curriculum to adapt with our context, and then redistributing funding resources in a very equitable manner, because this is really what we need to ensure that education is really decolonized and that all the points are touched. Right now, we'll be listening to Carmen Energy. I call her Carmen Energy because she always has the energy for all the group. And Carmen will be talking to us about what the Youth Action Group, commits to do in decolonizing education. We sorry we're rushing a bit. I can see interesting comments in the chat. Please continue chat. Keep them up. We're reading you, and we're happy to have you here in the house. So Carmen, as I said, is energy, and she got involved with the student movement in Spain for the first time in high school. Since then, she has held multiple leadership positions in the local, national, and continental, and even global level. She is the former president of the Student Council at the Complutense University of Madrid, and former president of the National Unions of Students in Spain. Carmen also served as membership coordinator of the European Student Union and is a founding member of the Global Student Forum's Steering Committee, where she represented the voice of more than 20 million European higher education students in the 2020-2022 mandate. Carmen holds a bachelor's degree in political sciences and public administration from Complutense University of Madrid, as well as a master's degree in international politics from Université Libre de Bruxelles. She is passionate about organizational development and the role of students and young people in shaping education policies. Carmen, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much, Karel, and thank you everyone for participating here today in this session. I think there are very little things that I can add to what the YAC commits to do, because it's been already showcased by the work of the youth and student constituency, not only during the GAWE, but also before, during these whole past years, where we've been engaging with many different stakeholders, many representatives of those are present here today. And we've been historically fighting for access to education worldwide. And the history of the student movement is, well, I cannot even describe how important it is, not only for me, but like for even like societies in every country. And something that I would like to do, because since we've been working in this Global Action Week, and since we've been working a lot on decolonizing education, but also on tax justice, this inspired me personally to read more and to study more. As we do, and I wanted to also contribute to the discussion by trying to come up with some ideas and try to draw some lessons from history. And I wanted to start by saying basically that if we take a long-term perspective, then the march toward equality and therefore to justice is actually well underway. History has shown us that inequality is essentially ideological and political, not economic or technical. Inequalities has actually been sharply reduced over the long term. And of course, this is thanks in particular to the new social and fiscal policies introduced during the 20th century, but still much remains to be done. But the fact that it is possible to go much farther, we can see that by drawing lessons from history. For example, the share of the richest 1% of the population fell sharply during the 20th century, when it was around 55% of total wealth on the eve of the First World War, and now it's close to 25%. It is important to note that this share is still about 5 times higher than the held by the poorest 50%, who currently owns 5% of the total wealth. So basically, to sum up, the concentration of ownership has clearly decreased over the past century, but it is still extremely high. The situation of the poorest 50% has improved more in terms of income than in terms of wealth, although again, this improvement is limited and unfortunately is also potentially reversible. So we can say still today that the poorest 50% of the world population is still the poorest 50% of the world's population. If we take the case of investment in education as an example, at the beginning of the 20th century, public spending on education at all levels was less than 0.5% of the national income in Western Europe, which meant extremely elitist and restrictive education systems. But then investment on education increased more than tenfold over the 20th century, reaching 5 to 6% of national income between 80s and the 90s, allowing for a very high level of educational expansion. This available data suggests that this development has been a powerful factor driving both greater equality and greater prosperity over the past century. Conversely, all evidence suggests that the stagnation in total educational investment observed in recent decades has contributed to both a rising inequality and to the slowdown in the rate of growth on average income. And of course, extremely high social inequalities in terms of access to education persist today. Educational quality and the welfare state are not enough to achieve real equality. The whole range of relationships of power and domination must be rethought. And in order to ensure a genuine circulation of power, the tax, and I would even say inheritance system, must also be mobilized to encourage a greater circulations of wealth. So here it is. History is showing us that if there is a will, there is also a way. One of the historical demands of youth and student-led organizations, as I said before, is for everyone to have access to quality education. Everywhere in the world, students and youth activists have been and are fighting still today, rising on tuition fees and the continuous commodification and privatization of education. And here, I would also like to point out that teachers and any other member of the education community are allies in the fight for better access to education. We shouldn't fall into the narrative of fighting each other, the economic system that prioritizes the market instead of prioritizing our future. So as I said before, there are many lessons we can learn from history. And as students and youth activists, it is our responsibility and duty to remind policymakers and governments that we do not demand charity, but rather we demand justice. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmen, so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think it was a very interesting conversation. Thank you to Maria, to Carmen, to Stir, to Ziad, to David, to everyone that joined us, to the panelists that share all their experiences and knowledge with us, and to all the people that join from very early in the morning in our region and very late in other parts of the world. So thank you so much for this. And I will now leave my dear Emil. She will be doing her closing remarks. And thank you to everyone. Emil, now I will leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for that facilitating, and thank you so much to Carol. You guys did such a great job. Our global coordinator says we're the largest social movement there is, and I think today did not only show that, but it showed that we are the most diverse and most impactful social movement there is. It was so great to see presentations from Africa, from the Arab region, to Latin America, seeing how our work goes into an international space. So I hope that what we've discussed today does not stay in these rooms. As youth organizations, please feel free to engage with the communication toolkit available on our GCE website. Please feel free, if you are part of a youth constituency and you love the work that we're doing today, please also email me at Amelia at the Campaign for Education. Thank you so much to all the speakers here today. And we hope that today was as impactful as it was for me, as it was for everyone. Thank you.